The Impact of Ebola on West Africans in 2014 by Jessica, Caitlin, Brittany, Melanie, Kaelin, Ethan, and Austin.
Morbidity is the occurrence of an illness or illnesses in a population. Mortality is the occurrence of death in a population. Temporal variation is changes in environment over time with respect to a disease. An epidemic is an occurrence of a disease clearly in excess of normal expectancy. Lastly, levels of prevention are a variety of activities that will prevent, delay the onset of, and/or reduce the severity of a disease and its complications.
Ebola virus background. Ebola virus was first discovered in 1976 in Sudan and Zaire. Researchers believe that fruit bats are potentially the original host of the Ebola virus. There are 3 species of Ebola virus that can infect humans: the Ebola virus Zaire Ebola virus, the Sudan virus Sudan Ebola virus, and the Thai forest virus, the Thai forest Ebola virus. Ebola had its biggest impact on West Africa in 2014. In 2014, there was an outbreak of Ebola, which was the largest outbreak since it was first discovered. There was a total of 28,616 cases, with 15,227 being confirmed by the lab. There was a total of 11,310 deaths between Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Although this is a deadly virus, it is very rare outside of Africa. Next slide, we're going to be talking about the total number of cases in West Africa in 2014. This map shows the number of cases in each of these areas during 2014, and as you can see, Sierra Leone and Liberia had cases that were up to 500 and 501 to 4,000. Guinea had cases up to 500, but it doesn't seem that they had as bad as an outbreak as Sierra Leone or Liberia.
Economic impact. There has been a severe economic impact due to the Ebola outbreak on countries such as Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. This economic impact has been estimated at $2.8 billion. This is resulting from a decrease in investment, production, and consumption. And this economic impact will continue to impact these countries, and it will be very difficult to overcome. The impact has led to higher unemployment, lost incomes, lower schooling, and less food consumption.
Ebola virus disease symptoms. The first and primary symptoms to arise after contracting Ebola virus disease include fever, fatigue, muscle pain, headache, and sore throat. Other symptoms that can occur following the primary symptoms are vomiting, diarrhea, impaired kidney and liver function, and possible external and internal bleeding.
Modes of transmission. When in close proximity to a person infected with EVD, avoid direct contact, including broken skin or mucous membranes, blood or bodily fluids, sexual contact, specifically contact with semen from an infected male, needles and syringes that have been contaminated, animals such as contaminated fruit bats or primates, or contact with a deceased victim of EVD. Who Ebola affected? Those with low socioeconomic status, people who consumed animals contaminated with the Ebola virus, or those who came into direct contact with those infected, bodily fluids, or shared needles. The Ebola virus disease is a zoonotic disease which involves animals and humans. From animal to animal transmission, evidence suggests that bats are the reservoir hosts for the Ebola virus. These bats can carry the virus to other animals, most commonly apes, monkeys, and antelopes. This creates the spillover event. It occurs when the animal, as listed above, or human becomes infected with the Ebola virus through contact with the reservoir host, the bat. This contact could occur through hunting or preparing the animal's meat for eating. An additional contact could occur through the fruit that the bat could have eaten from if it was contaminated and then a human were to eat it. This transitions over to human transmission. Once the Ebola virus has infected the first human, transmission of the virus from one human to another can occur through contact with the blood and bodily fluids of sick people or with the bodies of those who have died of Ebola. Examples may be traditional funeral practice, unprotected healthcare workers, and unprotected contact with blood and bodily fluids. This emphasizes on the importance of quarantine to the fullest degree. So, if there is an Ebola survivor, they may face new challenges after recovery. Some of them report effects such as tiredness and muscle aches and can face stigma as they re-enter their communities.
Environmental factors. A major environmental factor in West Africa is that many countries are still considered to be developing. This could be medically, financially, resources such as food, clean water, education. Number 2, seasonal changes. Since Ebola is actually animal transmission to human, the season can actually manipulate animals' behavior, such as their food source and water, and possibly even migration. which all can be affect the transmission of Ebola. An example of seasonal change is, for example, if it's hot weather. If there's a hot weather, animals will be forced to invade human space for their food and water. And three, areas with crops and dense populations, they usually will attract foreign animals such as rats, bats, or even vermin. Temporal variation. Temporal variation is actually very important. We're talking about the epidemic in West Africa. This is due to a widespread occurrence of the Ebola within a certain period of time. The outbreak started in 2014 in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, which is part of West Africa. The infant mortality rate was 92 deaths per 1,000 per year. Approximately 1 out of every 11 child will not make it to 1 year old. Also, recently, another small outbreak happened in Democratic Republic of Congo, which first case happened this year in May, which only killed 4 residents and only lasted 42 days. This is because a $41 million contingency fund happened after the events of 2014 outbreak in West Africa. We were so prepared for it, and that's how we limit our death and days.
Levels of prevention.
Despite raising death tolls in the year 2013, the disease outbreak was not reported until 2014. Why was there such a long delay in action? Let's look at some factors that led to the late announcement and slow action to control the outbreaks before it grew out of hand. Public health agencies in West Africa were facing a crisis at the start of the outbreaks. They were looking at a disease with a 50% fatality rate. The outbreak was thought to be a cholera outbreak at first, before lab tests confirmed that the source of infection to be the Ebola virus. With high death tolls and morbidity rates and no cure at hand, the agencies had no choice but to strategize primary prevention efforts to prevent people from getting sick in the first place. Primary prevention in the form of exposure avoidance was used to restrain mortality and morbidity rates from steepening. Surveillance teams comprised of trained health educators were dispatched to provide and implement health education in the communities surrounding the outbreak locations. Our surveillance campaign encouraged individuals to come forward to report cases. This helped epidemiologists trace the spread of disease. To encourage participation, the Ministry of Health of Guinea ensured the health care for all reported illnesses in this campaign period. Community members were taught Ebola-associated risk factors. Primary prevention messages directed at the public include avoiding contact or consumption of raw meat of fruit bats or monkeys. To reduce human-to-human transmission, people were encouraged to practice personal hygiene measures, such as washing hands. They were also encouraged to practice safe sex by using condoms to prevent transmission. Citizens were persuaded to make prompt and safe burial of the dead, and restrained from contacting the deceased bodies of infected persons, this way to protect them from contracting the disease. The monitoring activity of surveillance teams gave the opportunity to detect infections in its early stages, which allowed for timely care and prompt treatment. The work of these surveillance groups were an essential part of the social mobilization and community engagement aspect of outbreak control. As for the specific protection component, a vaccination trial was shown effective after a successful trial in Guinea. The trial utilized the ring vaccination approach, the same one used during eradication of smallpox.
Secondary prevention. So, as we have learned that primary prevention was the most cost-effective strategy to prevent the accelerated transmission of Ebola virus disease. Secondary prevention, on the other hand, is very effective in repressing the cycle of transmission. Secondary prevention of Ebola virus is classified into isolation and quarantine. So, how do these strategies work? Let's first talk about isolation. Isolation happens when those who are diagnosed with Ebola are isolated to cut off any route of transmission, and they will be sent to hospitals for treatments. And quarantine happens when people who are suspected to have come in contact with infected individuals are put into quarantine for 21 days, or so-called incubation period, according to the CBS News. It is really important to know the difference between isolation versus quarantine. As we can see that on the top right hand corner, the picture shows that a person is being put into quarantine in a hospital by healthcare professionals with advanced tech equipment to avoid spreading the disease while transporting the suspected patient. On the lower hand corner, the picture is showing an infected person being isolated and getting treatments. There are two outcomes of quarantine. Suspected individuals who show no signs and symptoms after 21 days will be able to return home and return to daily routine. On the other hand, Suspected individuals who show signs and symptoms during or by the end of the incubation period will be isolated for treatments. According to the CBS News, a new law required all individuals, including healthcare professionals, to be put into quarantine for a duration of 21 days before they can be released. Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, Liberia, and others were able to put an end to Ebola virus in 2014 through quarantine and isolation. The picture on the upper right hand corner shows a boy being released after the incubation period. And the picture on the lower right hand corner shows a healthcare professional getting ready to be put into quarantine.
Tertiary prevention. Tertiary is actually the last step of prevention. Further action is required if neither primary or secondary prevention is no longer effective. Tertiary strategy consists of rehabs, monitoring, and follow-ups. The focus of tertiary prevention is to prevent long-term complication and symptoms of the Ebola virus. Often rehab is required only under some circumstances, such as damages to the adrenal gland, kidney failures, liver failures, even swelling the brain. Overall, there's no cure for the Ebola virus, but there is some treatment to alleviate symptoms. Provision and support of intensive care capability would consist of having a highly preparational setting, therapy that consists of electrolyte balance and metabolic abnormalities. This could be from being hypovolemic, and there's also basic skills such as watching oxygen status level and monitoring blood level.
Importance to public health. The Ebola epidemic significantly impacted public health because it demonstrated the need for improved global preparedness, including a collaborative response when confronted with a deadly transmissible disease. Also, a more efficient way of warning the public on a global scale of this disease and the need for better travel laws, as Ebola was transmitted from West Africa to the United States via travel, and better prevention and care techniques for those who have Ebola and how to warn those with lower socioeconomic status about Ebola, and the need for more research regarding Ebola vaccinations. In addition, Ebola is important to public health because the epidemic had a significant impact on West Africa between 2014 and 2016. The total deaths in West Africa, including the specific countries of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, totaled 11,310 deaths. West Africans suffered the loss of loved ones, especially children who lost one or more parents. After this epidemic, West Africans faced social unrest and the adjustment to make life normal again. The next slide shows the importance to public health regarding a couple of images. The first image describes the West Africa Ebola outbreak and how it was the largest outbreak in history, and the likely host they presumably thought was bats, and 2 in 5 people who got Ebola in this outbreak died. The next image is a health advisory regarding the Ebola outbreak and how if you were traveling to West Africa, you would need to check with the CDC's website in order to learn more about Ebola and if you were at risk. And the last image is another health advisory regarding Ebola if you were recently in West Africa, and the symptoms including fever, headache, and body aches, and to watch those symptoms in the next 3 weeks. Also, if you get sick, to call the doctor and immediately tell the doctor where you had been traveling.
The Ebola outbreak in West Africa was first reported in 2014. 3 years have passed and outbreaks were contained to prevent a pandemic. However, gaps in knowledge regarding Ebola virus disease still remains. The natural host for the Ebola virus is still largely unknown. Most researchers believe the virus is animal-borne, and it's highly suspected that bats are the natural reservoir. Current research has looked into outbreak locations, distribution of bat species, vegetation, and amount of rainfall to see whether there is a pattern of conditions that induce outbreak. Further ecological investigation is conducted to see whether local bats, birds, and small vertebrates were infected during Ebola outbreaks. However, antibody evidence was inconclusive, and viruses were not isolated from the bat species studied. There wasn't an occurrence of mammal die-offs within outbreak vicinity. Again, the natural host for Ebola virus is unknown, and researchers still continue to research in this area. Considering the fact that there are over 250 bat species in Africa, you can imagine how this poses a significant problem for researchers in determining the natural reservoir for the Ebola virus. Vaccine candidates are being studied on their effectiveness. Key areas of gaps in knowledge include the durability and long-term potency of the vaccine. Most trials study protection against the Ebola virus 8 weeks after vaccination was received. Results of more long-term studies and follow-up
will determine how long the vaccine works to protect its recipient and will let health providers determine when boosters should be recommended. Also, development of vaccine that can protect multiple strains of the virus is underway. Scientists are tackling whether we can develop a vaccine much like the MMR shot to fight Ebola and its related diseases. We have much more to find out about the pathogenesis of the virus, and by gaining knowledge on how the virus replicates in the host, we can develop antivirals and post-exposure therapeutics that will halt infection and help infected individuals recover more quickly before permanent damage is done.
Suggested areas for further research. Community engagement. Adjustments need to be made in order to catch the virus in the early stages, which comes from community involvement. This could be done through preventative training, knowledge on the virus, and access to healthcare. Symptoms. Symptoms of Ebola virus commonly arise between 2 to 21 days after contraction, which increases risk of spreading the virus. Further research is necessary to find other possible symptoms. The earlier the symptoms are noticed and taken to the hospital, the quicker the patient can be quarantined and treated.
In conclusion, why does our group deserve $100 million? Our group deserves $100 million because Ebola has left a significant impact on our world. This outbreak caused people to lose their lives, their jobs, and their loved ones. Those who live in West Africa are still trying to get to their normal lives back. And in addition, this outbreak showed the need for better prevention and travel safety. This money would allow help for the countries financially impacted by Ebola and allow for more scientific research on vaccines for Ebola. It is important to recall that Ebola is very easily transmissible and that there is currently no cure. Therefore, a major importance to inform the public is through primary prevention. Why does our group deserve $100 million? Just to wrap things up, it will be helpful for those still recovering financially from Ebola and to prevent future outbreaks through primary prevention. As in the two images, the one on the left is a mother with her child, clearly in a poverty-stricken area, showing the effects of Ebola, and on the right is another image saying Ebola stops with me, because the more informed we are, the more we can help people. Thank you.